The last thing I should have been doing at my mother's funeral was concentrating on him. His hair was a little longer than the military cut he'd once kept. Gray hair tickled his temple and curled around his ears. His jaw held a circle of scruff around his full lips. His body had shifted from the lankiness of a teenager to the fullness of a man who now filled out a sharp black suit rather nicely. His eyes were shielded behind shaded aviator-style sunglasses, but I recognized him. Knox Silver stood on the opposite side of my mother's gravesite toward the back of the congregation. And he was watching me. The flutter in my belly and wobble in my knees was a telltale sign. Once familiar only in his presence, long forgotten in his absence. The sensation recalled a schoolgirl crush, and I hadn't felt this unsettled since I was 17 going on 18. Back then, it felt like we were the only two people that existed when he looked at me. That was 20 years ago. My current reaction might be only grief. Snapping my gaze back to my mother's coffin, I quickly look away again, blinking at the dryness of my eyes. Crying over our final goodbye seemed wrong somehow, like I hadn't earned my right to take on the role of a grieving daughter, given that my mother and I had a tumultuous relationship. She was a difficult woman in the best of times. Difficult to please, difficult to love, yet impossible to hate. Leaving me behind with a mess of conflicting emotions. For years, she'd wanted me to visit Sterling Falls, my teenage hometown. Her death was one way of making that happen. I'd avoided this place most of my adult life, despite the fact Knox Silver hadn't been present either, which made it all the more puzzling that he was here now, at her funeral. My mother hadn't approved of Knox or his family. His father had a bad reputation when we were kids. She'd feared Knox was the same, which hadn't seemed fair to my 17-year-old heart. She'd never seen Knox as I had. Sweet, solid, forever. Then again, she might have been onto something because Knox turned out to be a liar. He'd proven he was unreliable. He'd been unforgivable, but not unforgettable. And the last thing I needed, as I stood beside my two teenage children at my mother's funeral, were reminders of how naive I'd been when I was younger. With a shuddering breath, I wipe away all thoughts of Knox and return to the present. The minister is reading a prayer, but I'm still distracted. Birds chirp somewhere nearby. A soft breeze rustles the solitary tree closest to my mother's plot. My father's tombstone looks dull beside the freshly turned soil of my mother's final resting place. But the bright blue sky overhead causes the ache in my chest. The desire to run overwhelms me, to feel the wind in my hair, oxygen pumping in my veins, and the strength of my legs carrying me away. But I can't run, not today, not any day, not anymore. I glance at a picture of my mother that somehow made it to the burial service. The image is from her wedding day more than 40 years ago. She looks so young, so beautiful, but her eyes are as dull then as they'd been most of my life. She hadn't been a happy woman, and I'd borne the brunt of all her bitterness. A gentle pressure comes to my lower back. As I turn in the direction of Jack, I flinch. He shouldn't be here. He's been absent for most of the major events in our 15-year marriage. His presence today isn't warranted, especially as our divorce is officially final. There's no need for appearance's sake. No ruse necessary for the media. We are no longer the picture-perfect image of a family that didn't exist behind closed doors.
Would you like to say any final words?
The minister had approached. Jack's touch had been a signal I'd been spoken to, but hadn't responded yet. I shake my head. I don't want to talk. Not to more well-wishers, not to old acquaintances, not to anyone. I just want to run away, but I can't.